Hello and welcome back to the Alchemical Arts. Today I'm going to go back to the beginning, or at least not just the beginning for me, but the beginning for all of us, and that is ochre pigments. Ochre is really one of those things that have been around since literally the dawn of time. For humans, the very first experience we had of being creative, artistically at least in a visual sense, was with the ochre pigments. And whether it was through decorating our stories on the primordial caves of the Neolithic, or whether it was from body painting and various other sort of expressive outputs, that first decision, or that first realization that we could take the earth itself and draw forth colors that we could use to express meaning and the things that were going on inside of us was an important step. And it was certainly the first place I started as a kid, digging up big chunks of ochre like this out in the bush and processing it up and painting on, other stones, finding a flat stone surface and grinding it up and mixing it with some water and then starting to paint and seeing if I could refine the color and stuff like that. And so I wanted to share this with you today, the method of how we process ochre pigments to make them suitable for whether it's oil paints or tempera or gouache or even watercolors. So unlike a lot of my other pigment work so far, which involves a lot of chemicals and things that you don't really want to deal with, this is something you can do yourself at home, and it's incredibly rewarding process. I'll show you some of the techniques that you can use for processing up ochres and how to determine colors and things like that. I should preface this, if you are going to go out there and try and find your own ochre pigments, please be respectful towards whoever's land it is that you're on. So if it's your own land, that's fine. If it's like national or state park and stuff like that, maybe check to see whether it's okay, or in particular check if there's any indigenous landowners or traditional cultures in the area and see what their relationship to ochre is, because that's a long history there. But by all means, if you're out there and you find color and you find it in the earth, collect a little bit. By collecting little bits and pieces and stuff like that and then processing them yourself, you suddenly have this much deeper relationship between where you found the substance, the process you went through to work it into a paint or a pigment, and then ultimately what you decide to paint with it. It's great. This particular piece, for example, I've been holding on to since I was probably about 14 or 15 years. So some of the qualities of what ochre actually is. So ochre is predominantly just an iron oxide with varying degrees of water molecules in there, which give you the different sort of gradations from yellow through to orange, through to red and browns, almost all the way through to black. So it's all the colors that you see in rust. Now, it's more about the manner in which you find the ochre. So for example, like these pieces here, which I've also been hanging on to for a really long time, these are very hard. As you can see, they're sort of embedded, I can't even break them. And so they'll need a lot of processing in mortar and pestle like this. So one really good thing to have when you're wanting to process ochre pigments is a good, sturdy stone mortar and pestle. This one, on the other hand, for example, this is a very soft, chalky ochre, and I can wear away just through my fingers. And this could just be soaked directly in water and worked up from there, but again, mortar and pestle's your friend, it helps. So let's just get a little bit of a closer look in here with some of my ochre samples so that we can work out how you should ascertain what samples to process and sort of variations in color that you can get. So these ones here, they're a little bit poorer in color, particularly these yellows here. And so it's very hard to see when they're sort of dry like this what the final color once it's cleaned up is going to be like. Whereas a sample like this, that is, let's see if we just rub a bit of water on there. So like a sample like this that's more in the sort of red oxidey sort of color, that's a little bit easier to see. So, you know, as you can see, like I can color match these kinds of pieces together. I can seem to color match these kinds together because they seem to be lighter. This piece here, on the other hand, is a very interesting one. You can see various sort of, you've almost got a white creamy color up the top here, and it then sort of fades through to these delicately soft purples throughout the whole block. Now this is a very soft piece. You can see the cracks running through it with the little veins of light color coming through with these sort of purpley tones here. So essentially what I would do is start cracking this up and trying to sort out where each of the colors are coming from so that I can sort of purify it, basically. I want to make sure I get the right bits. Get some water onto this, you can start to see just what I'm talking about. How it all just comes to life. So this is like some soft sort of creamy white yellows through to these sort of reddy purpley tones. And in between you've got these sort of pinky oranges. It's going to be a bit of a pain, I think, to separate this piece up, but it is very soft, so it should be very easy to work. So I thought let's start by processing up these two pieces because I think they're of like a similar shade and hue. Because these particular pieces of ochre are of a harder, more stone-like nature, they're going to have to be ground in a heavy mortar and pestle here. So here I have a nice big granite mortar and pestle, which is quite excellent at doing these sorts of jobs. I've ground many things in here for a very long time, and it's good. Get yourself one of these. You can probably find them in a lot of cooking places. So essentially you just pop your pieces in there, and we'll just do like a sort of an initial pounding to sort of break up the pieces a bit. Sometimes also with the pounding to stop bits flying around everywhere, you sort of just put your hand on here, sort of just gently pounding there. I may have put a bit too much in the mortar, so I might just take this piece and pop it to the side for the moment while I work through these. The motion you want is sort of a gentle tapping motion, but with a bit of force behind it. But you don't want too much, you know, you don't want to be whacking it really hard that stuff's flying out everywhere. So it's starting to get, as you can see, the bits are starting to get smaller here now, and definitely more color is starting to show through as I break up the bits. As we start to get finer and start to do some of the grinding, I tend to like to put on a dust mask at this point. With ochre pigments, because they're not particularly toxic, it's not the worst to not have one, but with anything you want to avoid inhaling any sort of dust, so whether or not it's a benign thing like iron oxide here, good dust mask will serve you well. Quite a labour-intensive process, this one. I've already been at this for about 8 minutes now, and we still have a large amount of still quite big bits. Tiring work. One of the techniques I find particularly useful, especially when working with harder stones, is rather than just pounding down, what you tend to try and do rather than just pounding down is, as you hit, drag your mortar across the curves. So in one motion of pounding down and dragging, you tend to break up more material that way and faster. So this is what it's like after about 15 minutes or so. It's still very coarse, but there's a lot of fine powder through it. One thing I can do now while I'm at this stage, given that it's getting quite fine and powdered and we'll just start having dust end up going everywhere, is we can start wet milling it instead. So what I'll do is I'll just pour some water on in here and we'll sort of make a slurry that'll help us mill it without all the dust getting everywhere. And in a way it'll help too with milling down the last few bits, and we'll know once we get to a fine, smooth sort of slurry that we're done. This was the paste that I ended up with after grinding for quite some time. It's still quite gritty and isn't nearly as fine as it should be. For this next step, we will mitigate some of that problem, and yeah, so really the degree to which you want to mill this down as fine as possible is really up to you. It'll affect the yield of pigment at the end if you don't grind it enough, because the aim of this next step, the levitation process, which is what we'll be doing in these glass vessels here, the idea here is that we're wanting to separate the heavier material from the lighter, finer material. So any sort of sand or silt or impurities which are heavier than the actual pigment should settle at the bottom faster, and the pigment itself will take a lot longer to settle out. So we'll use this to our advantage. But I'll just try and get all of the mixture into here. Sometimes it pays to get your hands dirty. So once we've loaded the pigment into there, this sort of next step is mostly just to give the thing a big stir and make the work. So we want to stir it all up so that we get all of the pigment swirling up into suspension, and then quite quickly as we go, heavier material will start to sink to the bottom, and at about that stage I think we're pretty good to pour. And as we get towards the end, pouring carefully so that we retain all of that. So if you see here, we have at the bottom here all the heavier material that was either too granular or just not part of the color complex itself, so it was sort of sand impurities. So with this dish we can leave this till everything settles out, and then we can collect what's left by pouring off the clean water. Or we could do this process again back into here, but we clean this out and we would end up with again a more refined product but less of it. So I think I'm going to let this just settle out, clean it up, and then maybe work from there. So I've left this for probably close to a week now, and as you can see there's still fine particulate matter that's suspended in the water here, but there is quite a significant amount that has fallen through to the bottom. So what I'll do is I'm just going to pour off this water off the top here. And make an absolute mess. And this is what we have left here in the bottom of the glass dish. So there's quite a nice sort of layer of the ochre pigment here. It's quite a nice color. So let's just give this one more leviation by just adding a bit more fresh water. We'll empty this guy out. So I've got another flat dish here, and what I'm going to do here is just gently rotate this around to sort of suspend all the finest particles I can, and I kind of want to leave behind anything that's still heavy or too big. I think I'll add just a little bit more water into this and do that again. And just let it sit for a second. That should be long enough for things to drop down. Yep. And then pour slowly. You don't want to pour too quickly or everything will just flow through. So here's the pigment after drying for a few days, and as you can see here, it's obviously substantially lightened in color as the water has gone out of it. But it appears we have a fairly soft, uniform color, which I'm quite happy with. And if we compare where we started with, so this is the raw rock unprocessed, and this is the final color pigment. I think we've done a pretty good job in terms of getting a usable tone out of the ochre. I'm not really sure what to classify this as in terms of, like, it's not really a yellow ochre, it's not really a red ochre, it's sort of a soft, sort of pink, rose, sort of pink, orangey red kind of color. Yeah, it's a very typical Australian ochre colour. We get these sort of soft red, pink oxides. So in terms of processing this up further, what I would have to do to make it usable as an oil paint is I would probably grind and sift and maybe work it up on a stone slab with a muller for a bit, but we might leave that for another video. This has already got quite long as it is. And as I said earlier in the video, if you want to go out and try doing your own ochre pigments, please do, and let me know what the results end up being. I'd be keen to see what other people are able to do with their local sources of ochre, as I believe lots of places in the world you'd probably be able to find stuff that's suitable for making colour. Just one final little shot here of the pigment after I pulled it out of the evaporation dish there, and just gave it a very quick grind. I think I'd find this colour pretty useful on my palette, and maybe in a future video I'll show you how I'll work this up into an oil. Thank you for tuning in. Till next time, hope you have a wonderful day, and keep painting, keep experimenting, and keep exploring.